Hey, welcome to another exciting episode of the Standing for Freedom podcast, where we're defending life, liberty, and truth to ensure that freedom exists for the next generation. And I'm joined by somebody who needs no introduction. You all know who he is. It's Pastor Voddie Baucham. He's the author of a most recent book, Fault Lines, the Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. He's also Dean of the Divinity School at the African Christian University in Zambia. Pastor Voddie, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Well, we're honored to have you.
Glad we could work this out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Man, I know there's a lot of people in Virginia who love you, and then all across the country. The first thing I want to ask before we launch into the book, the first thing I think everyone wants to know, we're all praying for you. How are you doing? How's your health? How's your family?
And I'm doing great. The Lord was gracious and spared my life and has really brought healing, so my heart is fixed. My family, we were able to be here together during much of that ordeal, and we're looking forward to going back here in the next few days and putting all this behind us. But we're grateful for God's people, for their prayers, for their support, for their encouragement. It was really humbling to experience that in the midst of our darkest days. But we're grateful.
Awesome. Well, I do want to talk about some of the troubling things that we're seeing, we've been experiencing, the looming catastrophe that I think is possibly ahead of us. Certainly in the secular world it is, but it's also in the church. First of all, I've read much of this book. The most obvious thing I'm going to ask is, why did you write it? Why did you have a burden to write this?
I've been talking about these issues from a foundational standpoint since 2004, 2005, talking about issues of Marxism, Gramscian Marxism, what some call cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School. Of course, back 2004, 5, and 6, people just kind of, cross their eyes when you talk about these things.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing today with the critical social justice movement is really an outgrowth of that same ideology. So on the one hand, it's something that I've been thinking about and talking about for a long time. And on the other hand, I'm an American expat living abroad. And so looking at America from the outside and then seeing how people were perceiving America from the outside is what spurred me on to write this book and to jump into the fray and add my voice.
Talk a little bit about that from the outside perspective. You're in Zambia, you are seeing people around the world. Certainly people are asking you questions about what's going on inside the United States. So what is the perception out there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm living in a country where, the police will set up a road stop and stop you on the side of the road and, check for violations. And if they find them, they pull you over to pay your fine in cash. Mm-hmm. And they catch you, committing a crime. They beat you, publicly and whatnot. And so when our students began to ask me about my fear of the police in America, that was just kind of a wake-up call for me. People outside the United States, even people inside the United States. Some of these man on the street interviews, for example, where they'll ask how many unarmed black men are killed by the police. Yeah. And people will say 100, 500, 1,000 a year, and then they hear the actual numbers. Mm-hmm. And they're blown away when, they hear that 10 or 15 or whatever. They can't believe that that's true. Well, outside the country, it's the same, because the only thing that they're hearing about is this narrative. And so they believe that the police are literally hunting for black people to kill.
Man.
Yeah,
it's insane.
They literally believe that.
Yeah.
And so that really spurred me on to do this as well.
You see it. It's like an exercise in what some people call reflexivity. They report, so like during COVID, the number of COVID cases, not deaths, cases, because as those cases continue to rise, the death rate continue to go down, down, down. It's kind of funny how that is in the law of averages when you actually deal with numbers. So they were just showing the aggregate of cases. And what's interesting is the more that the media will report something, then the moment an actual situation happens, God forbid it happens, but when it does, they say, see, we told you, we told you this.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of an exercise where they're making those headlines
Right.
and then playing into it.
Yeah, and we definitely saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely saw that.
Yeah. So
And I think the George Floyd case is a perfect example of that. I've been pointing out to people that what's interesting about the Derek Chauvin trial is it is interesting what he was charged with, because I mean they didn't throw the book at him, they threw the library at him, right? But what was interesting is what he wasn't charged with. He wasn't charged with a hate crime. And what have we been saying? That this was a racist murder. And yet, the one thing that he wasn't charged with is a racist murder. Why? Because there's zero evidence that what happened in that case had anything to do with race or ethnicity. But when you hear people talk about it, they say that's the smoking gun that proves the racism in police brutality. Yeah, when the fact of the matter is nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah. The same thing happened to Tony Timpa. We're sitting here in Dallas, Texas. Same thing happened to Tony Timpa in Dallas, Texas in 2016, where the police put their knee on his back for 14 minutes and killed him. But nobody knows his name because he was white.
That's right. I've seen that video. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an I can't breathe situation.
And they're actually mocking Timpa.
They were.
And these guys were not fired. They were not tried. As far as we know, they're still on the job. Timpa's family didn't get $27 million. I don't think they got anything.
Right.
And so, again, we can all agree that these things are wrong. These things are horrific. And we can all agree that justice needs to be brought to bear in these situations. But what I can't agree with is that we have evidence that what happened was, in fact, a racist act.
Yeah. I want to talk about, obviously, the fault lines that exist within the church. I want to give warnings, clear warnings to Christians, especially young Christians, about this looming catastrophe that exists in the church. So right now, across the country, parents are rising up. They're going to school boards. Some people, the activists, are responding by trying to bus in people, to shout them down. What you're seeing within denominational life, it could be the Southern Baptist Convention, it could be the PCA or whatever, some places they're going to say clearly, unequivocally, we denounce CRT, we hate it, that it's a terrible ideology, but there's still systemic racism. We still agree that there are all kinds of problems with racism without actually identifying what those things are. Yeah. So what are you seeing, and what's problematic about that?
Yeah, what I'm seeing is a couple of things. One, people are saying nobody's teaching CRT. We're hearing that in the school system, and we're hearing that in churches and denominations, and so on the one hand, we're saying, I don't know what this is all about because nobody's teaching CRT. Then on the other hand, people are saying, we know CRT is bad, but nobody's teaching it, and then they don't want to denounce it, right? Because we don't need to denounce it because nobody's teaching it. Then they turn around and espouse the very tenets and presuppositions of CRT, but because they don't call it that, they go back and continue to say, nobody's teaching CRT. What's happening in the broader culture, for example, in these school boards and whatnot. Well, now you're hearing people on the news, people who've been advocates of CRT for years, basically saying, no, CRT is just about honest teaching on the history of race and racism in America, which, again, nothing could be further from the truth. That term critical and critical race theory ties it to the Frankfurt School, ties it to neo-Marxism. Whenever you see that word critical, understand that they're operating from an oppressor-oppressed paradigm. They're making assumptions about the need to problematize something so that there can be a revolutionary political response to that thing and an overthrow in that particular area. So critical race theory comes from critical legal studies, which comes from critical theory writ large. So when people say, no, this is just about honest teaching about the history of racism in America, the history of whatever. Number one, I don't know anybody. I'm 52 years old. I was taught about racism in school. We need somebody now to teach us about racism. I saw Roots when I was a kid, right? And all of a sudden now we need somebody to teach us about these things. Come on.
Yeah.
But secondly, if these people are about CRT, just knowing what the name means demonstrates that they're lying and soft pedaling this.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And you're also seeing this way in which people are going to try and soften the language a little bit because they know now, okay, that term is now a pejorative. Let's use a different term. What are some ways maybe that, and some people call this the kind of the third way, which is to it's kind of a soft ideology. And it's almost like a soft serve ice cream. Like, oh, this is good. I promise, I promise, I promise. It's not as harsh as that. It still acknowledges this. But what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think what they're doing is they're really continuing to fall prey to the ideology, but also allow it to creep in under another name or without a name. And the key to that is this idea of systemic racism. Some people say systematic racism or structural racism or whatever it is. And you've got to put an adjective on it, right? Because if you just talk about racism, now we're dealing with the heart of man, right? And we're dealing with ethnic pride and prejudice and, but when you talk about systemic racism and America being systemically racist, well, now you're going back to the first premise of CRT. And the first premise of CRT is the idea that racism is normal, that racism is baked in, right, to the structure of America, that racism is systemic. So that way you have racism without racist. You don't have to have a person with any racist intent. All you have to have is disparate outcomes for people, and now you prove systemic racism. Well, that's CRT.
Yeah.
So you've got Christians who are saying, well, no, we don't believe in CRT, but we just know that there's systemic racism.
Yeah.
Which is going back to the presuppositions that are at the root and at the core of critical race theory.
Absolutely. Thomas Sowell is so good on this. He says, we can't even guarantee the same and equal outcomes in families.
No.
So you might have you have how many kids?
9.
9 kids.
Yeah.
Your children will not all end up the same economically, socially, all of those things. You cannot guarantee for all 9 kids they end up exactly the same. If in the same household with the same parents, the same love and care and concern, you can't do that. How are you going to guarantee that the government, the angels of government, as Milton Friedman called them, would actually be able to do that?
Yeah, now, and Sowell points out that, firstborns have higher intellectual scores, they're higher earners than secondborn, thirdborn, whatever, right? So yeah, if you have disparate outcomes within situations like that, and we can't fix those disparate outcomes, then what else are we going to fix? And the other thing is, if you think about it, no two people are exactly the same. Some people are taller than other people. Some people are stronger than other people. That's why we have the Olympics every 4 years, right? Because we recognize...
Except for transgender, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we look forward to people testing themselves against competitors so that we can see, right, who can go higher, faster, farther, whatever, right? There are disparate outcomes there. And we recognize that there are disparate outcomes. There are disparate outcomes among nations and among ethnic groups. Some of those disparate outcomes exist because people have different interests. Some of those disparate outcomes exist because people are in different walks of life, right? Some people choose to have, 9 kids, therefore what they can do with their income is different than a family that chooses to have no kids. So they're going to be disparate outcomes. So people are naive on the one hand when they say that, we're trying to get rid of disparate outcomes. But then on the other hand, there are other issues that lead to those disparate outcomes. The classic example is fatherlessness, right?
Yeah.
We know that fatherlessness is tied to disparate outcomes in incarceration rates, dropout rates, rates of violent crimes, and a whole host of other issues. And so if we're going to talk about, for example, this black-white divide, and we're going to talk about disparate outcomes with black people, we have to acknowledge the fact that 72% of black children are born out of wedlock. If we already know that there are disparate outcomes associated with that, then we at least have to put that in as part of the equation. I'm not saying that that's the only issue. I'm saying that these are complex issues. And when you start looking at these sorts of things, another thing is the age of different groups of people. So the median age among one group of people is X. The median age of another group of people is, X minus 10, right?
Yeah.
So the median age of this group of people is in their 50s, median age of this group of people is in their 40s. Well, people in their 50s tend to be higher earners than people in their 40s.
Yeah.
So if you have two groups, right,
yeah.
you got to take that into consideration as well.
Right.
So if one ethnicity is made up of a very young population, they're going to be lower earners than an ethnicity that is made up of an older population. So again, we need multivariate analyses of these things. I'm not suggesting that there is no racism. I'm not suggesting, I write this in my book. I'm not suggesting that there is no, evil or wickedness or oppression or anything else. But what I am saying is that we're oversimplifying things when the answer for everything is racism.
Absolutely. I want to transition and talk a little bit about what's happening right now with, we're entering into the summer where, 4th of July is coming up. We just had the Juneteenth celebration. It seems as though there is this kind of enthusiasm now about June 19th in such a way, there are certain places in this country, counties and whatnot, that are canceling their July 4th celebration, favoring they're going to celebrate Pride Month, they're going to celebrate Juneteenth, but not July 4th, 1776, which was basically the basis, the foundation of the entire American experiment, imperfect as it was from the beginning, and yet enshrined in the Constitution and the Declaration were the freedoms and the principles that later
you
were
don't get
fulfilled.
Juneteenth without 1776, right? No, you're absolutely right. And part of that is this idea that America is fundamentally evil and fundamentally racist and systemically racist. And so there's this cognitive dissonance that goes on, right? We say America's horrible, America's terrible, America's systemically and fundamentally racist, and then we acknowledge the fact that people of color are selling everything that they have and gathering at the southern border in order to get into this country that is supposedly systemically and irreparably racist against people of color, right? It makes no sense whatsoever. And people who believe that America is just, fundamentally, systemically, and irreparably racist are arguing that it's a good thing that these people of color are coming into this country where they're going to be abused and oppressed. As we'd say in Texas, that dog won't hunt, and so I think part of what encourages me is that there is pushback. And when you push back against these ideologies, you recognize that they don't have a leg to stand on. The other thing that you recognize is they are looking for answers in places where those answers don't exist. But we do have those answers.
Let's talk about that. The church's response. It's interesting, Pastor, when I think about what the church has been focused, obviously evangelism, right? My concern now is that evangelism has gone into a kind of pragmatism that is kind of pan-theological or even theological minimalist in such a way that we remove any kind of barrier. Like, what are you signing on for then at that point? But it's interesting is that the church now even has a responsibility to actually tell history, to tell truth. I mean, to actually educate children in ways that the school system will not. The home needs to be doing that, but even churches, I think, have that responsibility. What's the pushback? How should it come?
Yeah, well, I think we need to do two things, and this is not my idea. This is the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, right? We know we need to take every thought captive to obey Christ, and most Christians are okay with that, right? We need to think about these things biblically. So when we think about race and when we think about economics and politics, we need to think about that biblically. But the first part of that is we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. That we don't want to do. Because again, 11th commandment, thou shalt be nice. We don't believe the other 10, right? So the idea that we would actually destroy arguments, right? The idea that we would actually expose the weaknesses in these arguments and that we would oppose these ideologies that are opposed to God, we really want no part of that. But the irony is, because we haven't opposed them openly, and this is what happened at the SBC, right? We knew that Resolution 9 from 2018 was out there on critical race theory and intersectionality. All of the uproar was about Resolution 9. And so we come, and the question is, what are we going to do about Resolution 9? Well, this year, we pass a resolution that addresses the issue of these ideologies and so on and so forth, but we don't name critical race theory and intersectionality. Yeah, we don't. We won't name it because we're not willing to do the first half, destroy these arguments, speculations, and lofty opinions. We have to do that. We have to name these things. We have to be aware of these things. We have to call them what they are. We have to oppose them openly. And then in Titus 1:9, what is the elder's responsibility? There's three things, right? That we hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, right? So that we can, 2, exhort in sound doctrine, and then 3, refute those who contradict it.
Yeah.
That's not optional. We have to expose the wolves. We have to refute the wolves. We have to beat the wolves away.
That's good. Final question. You're about to head back to Zambia. What's a word of admonition, word of warning that you would give both to parents and to young people about this woke ideology?
That it's pernicious, and that it's here. We can't avoid it. We can't get around it. And got to face this. And it's probably, if you're not talking about it, if you're not facing it, it has probably made greater inroads in your life and in your children's lives than you care to admit. And so that makes it even more important for us to face this and to deal with it and to know that we have the answer. People are looking for justice, they're looking for mercy, people are looking for reconciliation, and we find those things at the cross. God's justice poured out on Jesus, which allows him to be merciful to us and which ultimately reconciles us, not only to God, but to one another.
Great final word. Pastor Voddie, thank you for your work in the gospel, your labor in the gospel, for your labor in this book. Thank you for calling our attention to this crisis that's looming large in the church, and for being a truth teller and being courageous. We really appreciate it.
Amen. Thank you, brother. Thanks for having me.